being here. It's a complete delight and honour to be here amongst you, and I'm really grateful to you for turning up on a Wednesday evening when you could be at home watching telly or eating your own Easter eggs or whatever else you'd otherwise be doing. So thank you, and thank you especially to Tash for organising today and for letting me come and talk to you all. It's a real pleasure. My name is Chloë Houston, and I work at the University of Reading, where I'm joint head of department for English literature. Although I'm currently on a research leave sabbatical for a semester, so I'm not doing any head of department stuff. It's really lovely. It's yeah, complete dream at the moment. So it feels like a good time to be talking to you about Utopia. I feel kind of utopian in my work at the moment. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to talk almost all about Utopia today, but I'm going to start off with some dystopia. I only recently started teaching dystopia, which I'll mention in a moment, and I used to have a set of slides that I used with students that I would kind of try and encourage them to think about what dystopia means to them. But I've stopped using those slides because I find it so depressing having to update them all the time, and there's too much choice, right? So if you want to pick images of dystopia in our own current global politics, you are overwhelmed. I can't fit them on the one slide. So I've gone instead for some pictures from the Hunger Games, which are usually more popular and relate to dystopia in that the Hunger Games is probably the most popular dystopian set of films and books that all my students connect with, so that's why you're getting the Hunger Games instead. But insert dystopian images here, imaginary ones. So yeah, no shortage indeed. So at the moment, we are all familiar with dystopia. I think we have a common sense, I mean, when I say we, I mean, I suppose, you know, different groups, different societies, different parts of the world, but there's quite a dominant sense that we live in a dystopian age, so here we are, grappling with it. And we can see that, you know, around us in lots of different ways. Gen Z, who sometimes get called the Hunger Games generation, my current students, my third years, who I do my Utopian module with, were, you know, babies when the Hunger Games came out, so they have grown up with it. And they've also grown up with the dystopian worlds that have been constructed for them in art, music, literature, film and TV. And this is to testify that the dystopian futures category on Netflix contains hundreds of items and a whole series of subgenres. So you can have futuristic sci-fi dystopian futures, or you can have cyberpunk dystopian futures. Take your pick. I really like how it says, we think you'll love these. I don't actually like sci-fi that much, and I don't watch a lot of dystopian stuff, excepting The Last of Us, which I highly recommend. But nonetheless, this stuff is all over the place. Dystopia also dominates popular culture. I have looked. There is currently no utopian futures category on Netflix, and I don't know whether that's something that should give us cause for concern or something we should maybe celebrate. I don't know. But history shows us, I'm done with dystopia now. That's my dystopia paragraph. Because history shows us that in dystopian times, human beings turn to utopia. The utopian impulse, by which I mean the desire to imagine a better society and a better way of life, and that's sort of how I'm using the idea of utopia, the projected ideal society. A utopia is an ideal society that doesn't exist, but it's one that sometimes could exist, so it usually exists at a space, at a gap either of time or place from the readership or the audience. But the utopian impulse then, I think, is universal. As long as there is human suffering, there will be the human imaginative effort to not only escape it, but also to alleviate it by imagining idealized alternatives. And that is the business of utopia. At this point in history, we seem, I think, to somehow have lost sight of the ability, or lost our grip on the ability, to tell positive stories about the future. I think we need to do more of it. Those positive stories, like utopias, can give us hope, and they can also guide our behaviour and change the way that we act. And my argument, I suppose, is, or the work that I'm interested in doing at the moment, is based in the belief that radical acts of creativity and imagination are necessary for two purposes. They're necessary to offer comfort and hope, because it is a comforting and a hopeful thing to think about how to live better and what that might look like. But also to inspire, to motivate, to make us progress. And utopias are often accused of being about escapism. There's quite a negative sense around utopia, that, oh, it's a utopian idea. You know, his politics are just utopian, that they can never be achieved. utopias are not only about escapism, they're also about making change happen. And I would argue that much, social progress is motivated by utopian impulses. But utopia unavoidably gets a bad press. I'm sorry to mention Elon Musk. This won't last long either. But when Elon Musk can call himself, as he did here, admittedly a few years ago in 2018, a utopian anarchist, what meaning do those words have if Elon Musk is a utopian anarchist? And when someone tried to correct him and pointed out that Ian Banks wasn't really of his politics, Musk came back and said, no, well, his books actually support my position. But and this, on the other side of the slide, this image is of a town which Musk is building in Texas, which is to be a kind of workers' town for his organisations, and that's sometimes referred to as a utopian endeavour or a utopian creation. If you Google it, the word utopia is often associated with it. Doesn't look very utopian to me, anyway. There aren't that many pictures of it. I think it's called Snailsbrook, which I would also rename if I was building a utopia, but there we go. Dystopia and Elon Musk are finished with. The idea that utopian thinking can offer us solutions to the world's problems isn't, of course, anything new. It's an argument made by Thomas More, whose book is on the far left there. Thomas More's Utopia, which was published in 1516. And Thomas More invented the word utopia. It means both no place, because in Greek, topos means place, and the prefix ou means not, so it's the no place. But it also has the connotation of being a happy place, because in Greek the prefix eu, which makes a similar sound, means good or well. So it's like the good place that's also the no place, and that helps us think about how we still define it, I think. So More made that argument in Utopia in 1516 when he presented a society that seemed to offer solutions to the problems of the world that he lived in. And Rutger Bregman made the same argument. Rutger Bregman published a book in 2017 called Utopia for Realists, in which he argues that there are a number of ideas which we get from utopian texts or utopian thinking, politics, which could be really useful in society and which we could adopt. And they seem utopian and impossible, but he argues that we should pay them proper attention. And those include things like a shorter working week, for example, which personally I'm very much in favour of. So the radical visions of the women and men who have created ideal societies have also shaped the world that we live in today and continue to do so. And in this talk, I'm really thinking about literature more than I am real world utopias or real world communities. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from those communities, how they work, how they organise themselves. And that's really interesting to me, but it's not what I'm going to discuss today, because my work is in literature, really. The premise of what I'm interested in, or the kind of the premise of my argument, I suppose, is that the utopian impulse is universal. It exists in all cultures. It's existed in all periods in history, and that it exists all over the world. And I believe that that impulse to utopia, to create a better society, is essentially the same, which is to say, I think it doesn't change. The utopian impulse is to create a better society, to imagine a better society in order to help you improve the one that you're living in. That stays the same no matter where you find it, but it also changes. It evolves throughout time. Utopias are not the same. They're very, very different, not just because different people imagine different utopias, but because at different times in history, different things seem important. And what you see in someone's ideal society tells you about what's important to them. I think that's something, we can all spend a bit of time thinking, what would my utopia look like? And often just doing that as a kind of game with yourself, imaginative game, tells you about what's important to you. I feel like I'm speaking within a kind of utopian community, so you've already been doing this sort of, not just as a imaginative game, but as a way of being and working, which is more practical than the kind of thing I'm talking about. So utopia is universal. It's not confined to my area of specialism, but what I'm going to talk about is early modern utopias, by which I mean utopias of the 16th and 17th centuries, and that's because that's where my work is. I wrote my PhD on early modern utopian fiction And I use the word fiction to describe the texts that I work on because they are largely imaginative texts. But it's worth noting that they were also written not just to entertain, but to contribute to wider debates and conversations about politics, about how life should be lived. And so many of the texts that I read I would consider to be political texts as much as they are literary texts, or rather I'd argue that there isn't much difference between politics and literature, certainly in the period that I work in, arguably at all. You know, that's a conversation for another day, isn't it? So I published that research in a book which was called The Renaissance Utopia. That's an academic monograph. I think about 5 people have read it. What I'm keen to do now is to think about how to kind of bring that research and to do a bit more with it, and that's sort of what I'm thinking about at the moment. I haven't written anything later than Gulliver's Travels, which is in the Middle Earth from the 18th century. But around 10 years ago, I started teaching a course at the University of Reading to students of English literature, and initially that was called Utopia. It's now called Utopia and Dystopia because the students want to read dystopias, I want to read utopias, so we kind of meet in the middle. And the contemporary literature on that module then is more dystopian than it is utopian. So the contemporary literature is not so much this stuff. These are mostly utopian texts, people like Edward Bellamy, Margaret Cavendish, Sarah Scott, William Morris. The dystopian texts are things like 1984, Brave New World, those sorts of texts. But my teaching has allowed me to keep in touch, I think, with thinking about utopias. And the way that I'm interested in doing that at the moment is in a new experiment research project that we have at the University of Reading, which is run by me in English literature, by my colleague Jeremy Burkhart in history, and by Nigel Arnold, who is a professor of meteorology. And that project is called the Utopia Experiment, and our aim is to think about how we can use utopias, both literary and historical utopias, so real life ones as well, to address the problems of climate change. So we're working with meteorologists to try and think about how we do that. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because Nigel's belief as a meteorologist, and he's a proper scientist, so that's why I'm using him as an authority here, Nigel's belief is that we need to tell more positive stories and to use positive stories to address the issues of climate change and to motivate people in their behaviour. And we had our first symposium yesterday, which was really great at the university, and we heard talks from people working in psychology about the importance of positive psychology around action and climate change, which was really interesting. And so I'm hoping this will kind of have some fruition. That is a bit of information about the Utopia Experiment, but not very necessary now. But that research project at Reading is born out of the belief that the relationship between people and the land is very important. And my colleague Jeremy in history is a rural historian. His history and his work is in history of the countryside, and that's something that Reading has a real specialism in, with the Museum of English Rural Life and with other colleagues who work in that field. So that's why I think it's a really good place. We also have a specialism in meteorology and in climate science, so that is why it feels like these things should come together at Reading. And I think that, we sometimes have a habit, maybe in both literary and historical studies, of looking back to the past in quite a nostalgic way. And I'm aware that, that sort of sense, I suppose, that people used to do things better, and or used to kind of have a more direct relationship with the land, for example. But what we're keen to do with this project is to think about movement forwards and how we learn from the past and from literature, but how we put that into practice, not just how we kind of notice what they were doing well. And I think that utopian and dystopian literature, it's quite hard to separate the two, but I think utopian literature can offer us some really important lessons about how to do this. So this is what I think these lessons are. Firstly, I think utopian literature teaches us that the relationship between people and the land is important, and it must not be neglected or taken for granted. And I know that's a very obvious thing to say, and a very obvious thing to state, but it does feel like it needs stating in some context, so that's why I begin with that. Nurturing that relationship utopian literature teaches us, means restoring people's capacity to have a direct relationship with the land, which they can only do if they have access to it. And that's maybe where aspects of my interest in this, I think, become political, because I think that literature is still political now in terms of the decisions that we make about who gets to have access to the land. Yeah, so that's something which I think is relevant. The third thing is that utopian literature teaches us is that human beings make mistakes all the time. In Thomas More's Utopia, he would have understood that as sin, that humans are sinful, and because we're sinful, we can't live in perfect societies. I don't think the concept of sin is one that most of us would want to embrace these days, but I'm absolutely behind the concept of making mistakes and being flawed. Human beings are naturally flawed, we can't live in perfect societies, but we can make progress. And one of the things that utopias teach us, I think, one of the things that they model for us is progress, not perfection. Utopias are often associated with perfection, the ideal society, but actually they're rarely about making people want to live in exactly that society. Most utopias, when I work with students on lots of different utopian texts, and I always ask them, would you like to live here? And the answer is almost always no, because no matter how good it is, there's something there you don't like. So in Thomas More's Utopia, you only have to work 6 hours a day. That's pretty good if you're a 16th century, pretty much anybody who's not in the aristocracy. 6 hours a day of work is amazing. But one of the things students often don't like is that you all have to wear the same clothes, right? So you're wearing a kind of smock uniform. So that might put you off, or it might put you off. I mean, there's worse things. They also have a system of what's basic slavery. So it's not just about the clothing. I don't wish to denigrate my students' approach to it. But the point I'm making is there's always something wrong with utopia, because utopias don't work for everybody. But what they teach us is ways to model progress, and that's sort of what I think we can gain from them. So how do we see this in utopian literature? And for the rest of what I'm just going to talk about really is just a few texts. I'm just cherry picking a few different early modern texts that I think demonstrate these sorts of arguments to us, or engage with the ideas that I'm interested in. The first one of these is called The Tree of Commonwealth by Edmund Dudley, and it's from 1510, so I'm sorry in the way of the quotation there. Edmund Dudley wrote much of The Tree of Commonwealth while he was in prison for treason, and he was put to death for treason in 1511. So certainly someone who knew what it was to write in fairly constrained times. Also somebody who wrote this very kind of evocative text. It's a political text, very evocative of the natural world, while he was completely absent from it, because there aren't many trees in the Tower of London, but that's where his mind was going. When he wanted to come up with a metaphor for how the Commonwealth, by which he just meant England, society, should operate, he used the metaphor of a tree. And Dudley wrote about how a tree, his kind of ideal tree, was rooted in justice, truth, concord, and peace. Those were the qualities that it was rooted in, and it would bring forth fruits. Dudley described these fruits as being honourable dignity, worldly prosperity, and tranquility. These were the fruits that he wanted the tree to produce. And his image of the tree as a stable yet dynamic commonwealth, because a tree works very well as an image of something which is stable, continual, always the same, and yet forever changing, moving, and adapting. That was useful to him in describing how he thought the ideal society should work, that it should have those same qualities. And he believed that the proper organisation of society would enable the prosperity of each individual as well as the group as a whole. And I think, again, the tree metaphor works well for him there. So he says here, this quotation that I'm using on this slide, the commonwealth of this realm, or of the subjects or inhabitants thereof, and he's using the term there, commonwealth, to mean literally the communal richness, the communal riches of this country, or the subjects or inhabitants thereof, may be resembled to a fair and mighty tree growing in a fair field or pasture, under the cover or shade whereof all beasts, both fat and lean, are protected and comforted from heat and cold as the time requireth. So this ideal tree will provide comfort to all of the animals who are able to shelter under it. In like manner, all the subjects of that realm where this tree of commonwealth does surely grow are thereby helped and relieved from the highest degree to the lowest. Trees don't discriminate in who they protect. And that's, so the tree metaphor enables Dudley to make what I think is actually quite a beautiful and profound argument about how an ideal political community might work. And I think it, so in terms of the point I was trying to make a moment ago, I think it, you know, his mind goes to a natural metaphor because that is something that all of his readers can share and understand, and I think it gives a kind of a beauty to his writing which makes it very appealing. So that's you know, one kind of text I think that's doing the sort of work that I'm interested in. In the utopian literature of this period, the 16th century, when humanity is out of sync with nature, this causes problems. So when people write utopias, when they project their ideal societies, they usually go to some effort to explain why the natural world works for the people who live on it, you know, why there's a close relationship between people and the land. And they use humanity's relationship with nature to explain how society should work in the way that Dudley does. And another person who does this is Thomas More. And Thomas More's book I mentioned a moment ago, Utopia, is kind of, you know, like the founding text, I suppose, for thinking about ideal societies in my period. So Utopia is written in 2 books. The first book is a conversation between a group of friends, and one of the things they're talking about, well, 2 questions particularly. One of the things they're talking about is how the educated man, and they do mean men, it's a conversation amongst men about men, how the educated man should best serve society. What should he do? Is it best for him to take himself off somewhere and pray? Is it best for him to be a monk, to pray, to kind of commune with God? Is it best for him to offer his services to the king and try and put his education to use, to be a kind of politician, essentially? And More himself was thinking about that in his own life at the time, because he'd spent 4 years living as a monk in the Charterhouse in London, and he was a trained lawyer. He was about to go into service at the court of Henry VIII, and that service would end 20 years later in him losing his head also for treason. It was a dangerous job, wasn't it, being politician for Henry VIII. Both More and Dudley, these great utopian thinkers of the time, were put to death for their, in More's case, his religious beliefs. I've lost my train of thought thinking about More. This makes me feel a bit sad. What happened to Thomas More? So we see in book 1. So yeah, the first thing he discusses is what the kind of educated man should do, and the second thing is really just about all the problems in society. What's wrong with Tudor England? The main thing really that is identified in that is the conditions in which people are having to live. And certainly in the early 16th century, you know, of course there's no welfare state, there's no social support, there is no healthcare, you know, there's no access to education unless you're well off enough to pay for it. And there are frequent periods of famine and drought, which mean that people are living in appalling conditions and barely subsisting, while others are extremely rich. And More identifies this as being a major problem. So that's what happens in book 1. And then in book 2, one of the people who's in the conversation in book 1 tells everybody about Utopia. And Utopia is this idealised society that he has been to and visited and spent time in. And he's a complete convert to it. He tells everybody how wonderful it is. And the main, or the most sort of obvious qualities of Utopia are that there is no money, there is no private property. Everybody lives in communal housing. They still have the family as a unit of social, kind of identity, but everybody has enough to eat, everybody has to work. It's no surprise that More's Utopia was a text which was very much latched onto and very exciting to communist thinkers who saw this as an early example of what communism could be like. There are all sorts of problems with Utopia as well, so it's maybe not as perfect as it seems, but that's basically how the text works. In book 1 then, one of the things that More identifies is this dislocation of the relationship between humanity and nature. So whereas in the tree of Dudley's book about the Tree of the Commonwealth, we have this idealised relationship between humanity and nature. In book 1 of Utopia, we have images of the disruption of that relationship. And one of those is in sheep, is in what are in Utopia man-eating sheep. These are not man-eating sheep, that's a picture I took in the Lake District a week ago. Well, I didn't hang around very long, so who knows, but I don't think so. Your sheep, he writes, and this is from book 1, as I mentioned before, your sheep that were used to be so meek and tame, and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. So more disrupts the typical image of the sheep as an animal which is meek and mild and easy to farm, and disrupts that and makes it into the sheep is a predator of humanity. And the reason that has happened is because the sheep have been allowed to take over the land which used to belong to the people. So Moore's using that image of man-eating sheep to refer to something that all of his readers would have known about, which was the practice of enclosure. So in the early 16th century, and we see it in the 18th century too, various different times in English history, but in the early 16th century we see this practice of enclosure happening, which was where landowners who technically owned or were able to claim ownership of common land, which had traditionally been farmed by people, the poor people of villages and communities, landowners were able to claim ownership of that land and to enclose it so that people couldn't go on it. So people who'd made their living from that land, only in the smallest way possible, so that might involve having a couple of sheep or goats on the land, or it might involve being allowed to cut the turf or cut peat from the land to burn, or it might involve being allowed to go around when crops were picked and gather up what was left over. So just that kind of subsistence living off the land was suddenly not possible anymore, and that meant that people who'd been living on the edge of poverty had nothing at all, and that was causing a lot of social disruption in Tudor England, especially from the back of a couple of bad harvests, and a lot of poverty. So what I'm interested in here is how Utopia uses a natural metaphor to express that, to speak to its readers. It's about a disruption between humanity and the land. This is not how it's supposed to work. And Moore, I think, is making a political point through that metaphor of the man-eating sheep, which is it's a very brief moment in the text. Utopia is a massive book. Not that much of it is about sheep, but that image of the sheep-eating men is really powerful, I think, like the tree. The next utopian that I want to consider, so we're going to skip forward more than a century to another of my favourites, and I don't have an image of his text because I've just got an image of Francis Bacon here, but I think he would have liked that better because Bacon was very into his own image, particularly his clothing. On the day that Bacon got married, he dressed head to foot in purple velvet, which was forbidden to all except the very highest people in society in his day. So not only did he look fabulous, but he was making a political point about himself there. So I think he would have liked a picture of himself here instead of his text. Francis Bacon is from a very different period, moving into the 17th century, and his ideas about humanity and the natural world are also very different from the ones I've looked at so far. Bacon practiced natural philosophy, which is what we would call science, although they didn't use those terms in the 17th century. And he's often understood as a kind of father or a father figure of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, because he developed ideas around how knowledge should be organised, and around how experiments should be undertaken and things like that. He was really interested in that. And so he's a kind of founding father of science in this period. But for Bacon, natural philosophy, the practice of science, was something which had very strongly very strong religious motivations and grounding. So although we sometimes now, I think of the interests of science and the interests of religion as being sort of different, sometimes even opposed to each other, for Bacon they were one and the same, because he believed that God had left humanity two books. The book of his words, which is the Bible, and it was humanity's duty to read the Bible and to learn about God that way. but also the book of his works, which was the natural world. He'd left the planet, and the planet was there for humanity also to read, to learn, to know about, and to find out more about God through looking at his creation. So those two books are just as important to each other, and for Bacon, a really important motivation for carrying out natural philosophy. That's for nothing. So in Bacon's ideal society, Bacon wrote an ideal society which is called New Atlantis, and he didn't quite manage to finish it because, well, probably, I mean, either he got bored of it and didn't want to finish it, or he died before he could finish it. I don't quite know. I don't think anyone quite knows which is which. Bacon died in 1626. I was about to say history has it. It's not really strictly history. You can tell I'm a literature person, not a historian, when I say things like history has it, because there's not really a reliable source, but it's a good story, so I will say it anyway. The story of how Bacon died, history has it, is that he died after trying to stuff a chicken with, a dead chicken, with ice, with snow. Because he believed that if he could make the meat very, very cold, it would preserve it. He was right about that. But allegedly he caught a chill and then 3 days later died of pneumonia, which is the kind of thing that could happen to you quite easily in the 17th century. As I said, I don't think there's much evidence for it, but it's a good story. But there are no chickens in New Atlantis, however. He does, well, there may be. There are a lot of birds, because one of the things that Bacon has, New Atlantis is this ideal society. It's discovered by a group of travellers who have a shipwreck and arrive upon it. But the main focus of the society, Bacon's not really interested in the politics, like the other writers I've talked about. What he's interested in is the practice of science. So the main focus of New Atlantis is this institution called Salaman's House, which is like a cross between a scientific institute and a university, but it's also where all the power is in society, because the fathers of Salaman's House, which is the name of the people who run it, they directly inform what happens politically, and they travel around the world, so they know about everything that happens in Europe. They already know all about it, even though Europeans have never heard of them, and they spread their knowledge, but only when they want to. They mostly keep things pretty secret. So one of the things that Bacon makes clear in his description of Salaman's House is how much better they are at everything they do than Europeans when it comes to science. And the way that he shows this is by showing their control over nature. So, for example, in New Atlantis, the fathers of Salaman's House have invented something which is called a water of paradise. And the water of paradise is like normal water, except that it's not only good for you in terms of hydration, but it's good for you because it prolongs human life. So the more, if you drink this water, you'll live a little bit longer. And there are many of the inventions that Bacon describes in New Atlantis are things which humanity since developed and invented. And one of my favourite games to play with my students with this text is to see if they can kind of like reverse notice them. What can we notice that Bacon imagined that we actually now have? And my favourite one of those recently was last year with my group of third-year students, when one of them described a magic powder. Bacon says there's a powder which you can consume as a foodstuff and it will make you super strong. And one of my students said, well, that's just like protein powder that bodybuilders take, that's it. And that hadn't occurred to me because it's not something I'm familiar with, but there we go. All of these things have a kind of future life beyond the text. Lots of them have been discovered since. But my point is really that for Bacon, it's the way that all of these brilliant things are achieved for humanity, like living longer and having more beautiful music, and being able to make things fly, for example, this kind of superpowers they seem like. The way that humanity has achieved that is by its relationship with nature. And the way that it's developed that relationship with nature is through investment. The society has put a lot of money and a lot of support into this institution and the work that it does. And I think Bacon, in some senses, is making a kind of manifesto for his ideal university or his ideal research institute, where he would get to have all the power and they'd get given a lot of money and they would then produce all of these wonderful benefits for society. So the ideal society comes there from a very close relationship with nature and from really understanding nature and from taking the time to pay attention to it and to learn about So that, I think, also is an example. It's a very different sort of example, but it's an example of what the early modern focus, I think, on nature in the ideal society. So early modern utopias almost always address the question of the relationship between humanity and nature and insist on its closeness. So when humanity is in sync with nature, things go well, and when they're not, things go badly and the sheep start eating the people. And I'm not trying to suggest that these texts are, kind of right or correct or have brilliant ideas about how humanity should live with nature, but just drawing attention to the fact that they recognise the importance of that relationship, that it's central to human beings' capacity to live well, is that they live in harmony with nature. And this is an idea that more imaginative literature of the period also developed. So the texts that I've looked at so far, I think you can argue all of those are utopias. They are deliberate projections of an ideal society. There's somebody saying, this is what this place looked like, and making up an ideal society. But I think we see it in more imaginative literature too, and one example of that would be in Shakespeare's As You Like It. As You Like It is one of Shakespeare's comedies which has within it a space that sometimes by critics called the green world, which is usually a forest space. And usually what happens is that characters enter that forest space and they are transformed or have extraordinary experiences there, often kind of magical experiences. So one of the best known ones would be A Midsummer Night's Dream, in which Bottom takes on the head of an ass, and which lovers are made to fall in and out of love with each other using magic potions. These are the sorts of things that happen in Shakespeare's green world. And they can't happen outside of it. They don't happen. Typically, the green world is like the opposite of the court. These things don't happen in the court, they happen in the forest. And quite frequently, that involves being transformed into animals, humans being transformed into animals or spirits of some sort. And these transformations, I think, suggest the extent to which the green world is an environment which is different from the court, but it can also make people be different. They can behave differently when they're in it. And so it's not just about, being in a strange environment, it's about what that environment, strange in the sense of uncommon or unusual to you. It's about how that environment can make you behave. And that's exactly what happens in As You Like It, because in As You Like It, the experience of being in the forest allows characters to experiment with new identities, to take on new selves, to live in a freer, more creative and more harmonious way with each other as well as with nature. So one of the reasons why I think As You Like It is often a really lovely play to watch in performance is that you often get this real sense of the camaraderie of living in the forest, that the people who live there have these very strong bonds with one another. They love each other, they fight with each other as well, they literally fight with each other, but they have a bond and an enjoyment of nature, an enjoyment of their lives in the forest, which I always find just so beautiful to watch. And that's about what the actors are doing. That's not about even the language, it's just about what actors often do, or directors often do with those scenes. As well as taking on new identities in the forest, people can learn from the new identities that they take on. And this is a quotation which is from the beginning of Act 2, and the person who's speaking here is the Duke. So the Duke has been exiled to the forest. He's been usurped by his younger brother. And so he spends some time living in the forest, but he likes it. He has a good time there. And he's talking here to a friend of his, Amiens, about the fact that that this is a good place. This is a place where he can learn. And he says, "Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this, our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." And the Duke is claiming here to have been able to, something bad has happened to him. He's been ejected from his life at the court, but he's been able to find good in it. And one of the ways that he's done that is that he has learned from nature. He's been taught by the natural world. Our life, and I think he's using the royal we there, is our life, exempt, but he might also mean the people around him, exempt from public haunt, not having to be in public at the court, finds tongues in trees, so he is able to communicate directly with the trees. The trees become personified in talking to him. And it's worth noting here, I think, that conversation is one of the main modes of education in Renaissance England. So when people talk about speaking, they're often talking about learning. So that's relevant here. I think it's not just about having a good chat, it's about learning from the trees. Books in the running brooks, so the running brooks are also sources of education. He can read them like you would a book. Sermons in stones, again, sermons are not only kind of religious communications in this period, but they are also there to teach you. That's the job of a sermon. And good in everything. And there is our image of utopia, of goodness in everything, in the natural world that he finds. And so here's what I find a very beautiful image of how the natural world can teach, even though the Duke hasn't gone looking for it. He has learned from it and found this beautiful community there in which there is much more equality than the world that he's come from. So there is a leader, but there's much more a kind of feeling of being all friends together in the forest. It's worth noting, though, that the Duke doesn't stay in the forest forever. He goes back to the court at the end of the play, and that frequently happens in Shakespeare's comedies of the green world. The characters who have the chance to live these transformed lives don't stay in them. Bottom gets his own head back at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, and he can't quite work out what's happened to him. It's just something weird. He doesn't really know. And the Duke, similarly, at the end of the play, goes back to the court when he gets the opportunity to do so. And we don't know, as the audience or the readers of this play, we don't know whether he's going to make use of what he learned in the forest when he goes back to the court. Maybe he does. Maybe he goes back a better person. Maybe he rules a bit better than he used to. Or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's just, completely like he used to be. We don't know. Shakespeare's comedies, even though they seem often so beautifully tied up at the end, often have these spaces of not knowing. And I think one of the things we don't know in Shakespeare is what the lasting effect of the green world is, because we don't get to see it. But nonetheless, he finds lessons in nature in this moment of experience. And one of the things I really love about studying the drama of this period particularly is how texts change in performance and how they change when you read them and see them being performed in different times. And a couple of years ago I saw a performance of As You Like It at the Soho Theatre. It was the first time I'd seen it, or I hadn't read it either, since lockdown, since the pandemic. And I found its evocation of the natural world particularly beautiful, particularly joyful, I think, in the context of having recently been through lockdown and that experience, which of course was very different for different people, but for me involved spending a lot more time just sitting in my garden and sitting in the woods and being still in nature, and was although I don't wish in any means to suggest, of course, that the experience of the pandemic was positive. There were for me, these positive and very beautiful moments in it, which I cherished. And I do remember conversations that we had at that time when we thought, would we be able to take the lessons or some of the things that had changed, having empty skies with fewer planes in them, having cleaner air. I remember talking to friends about this, and we thought, is this a moment where we could actually change some stuff? Because here we are living without some of these things. What would happen if we tried to hold on to some of these aspects of how we're living in this very strange time? And we didn't, I think, probably do that in a transformative way. But I think for me, the experience of seeing the play in the aftermath of that was particularly touching. The idea of this sort of green moment of utopian possibility, and utopias, they don't always last, but they do offer us these moments of space sometimes. And I just want to make clear that I'm not talking, especially as this is being recorded, I'm not talking about COVID-19 as utopian in any sense. I'm just trying to connect to the particular feeling that I had about being in nature during that time. I just want to make that clear, because we all have had different experiences, and of course for many people it did not give an opportunity to spend more time sitting in the garden. I was extraordinarily lucky to have that, so I just want to make that clear. Being immersed in nature can be transformative. We know that it can be magical. We know that it can do incredible things for us as people. As human beings, when we have the opportunity to immerse ourselves in nature, we are transformed by it. And that kind of connection is, I think, something that Shakespeare shows so beautifully in his works, but it's all around us in literature, and not just literature of the 16th and 17th centuries. At the end of As You Like It, there's an epilogue which is spoken by the actor playing Rosalind, and it sort of reminds us, so Rosalind is one of the main female characters in the play, and she dresses up as a man for a period of her time in the forest, and that one of the things that she gets to do is to kind of live a man's life for a bit, and that's transformative too. But we remember that in the 17th century theatre, certainly when As You Like It was first performed, 16th century theatre I should say, that's a bit of a mistake to make, never mind. But in the 16th century theatre, all the female parts were played by men. So it's a man playing a woman's part, playing a man's part. And so when Rosalind comes up on stage at the end and she says, just remember, she said, you know, she sort of talks about how she would, she says at the end, if I were a woman, I'd kiss all of you men who had beards that pleased me, complexions that liked me, and breaths that I defied not, I think she says. So she talks about how she would, if she were a woman, she would do these things, and she can't because she's a male actor speaking these words. It's a kind of joke. But she draws attention to the fact that she isn't the person she's been pretending to be. And in doing that, I think the theatre often sort of, maybe it closes down that feeling of transformation, I don't know, by sort of insisting that it's not true. But we can think about that in different ways, I guess. So the green world in As You Like It is not perfect, and it's not the Garden of Eden, but it is a place of restoration and learning. And recent productions have shown how that can particularly be brought out. I didn't see this one, but this was one from the Watermill Theatre in Newbury in 2021, where the green world was presented as a kind of ecological protest camp. That's how they use that space. So definitely people have engaged more directly with the political context of it in small ways. How am I doing for time, Tash? Sorry, I just haven't got a watch in front of me.
It's 8:30.
Okay, 8:30.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just do a couple more minutes. I want to finish just really briefly with someone I'm interested in at the moment, just to tie things up. This is John Portage, and I have no idea how you pronounce his surname in Latin. Johannes, we'll just call him Portage still, because it's a very complicated set of vowels there. John Portage lived in the 1640s and 50s, and that was another time of real social upheaval in England, when, again, extreme poverty and deprivation for the working people of the country. There had been very poor harvests and illnesses in cattle and in sheep, which meant that livestock were decimated. And there was famine. And in the midst of this famine, in 1649, 5 people went to St George's Hill in the parish of Walton-on-Thames in Surrey and began digging the earth. And they became known as the Diggers. They've really grabbed people's imaginations because they're a group that we still, people still sort of hear about and think about and talk about. Their community there lasted only a few months, but during the time that they were there, they were insisting upon the right of the common people to work the common land, and so they were trying to prepare that common land for farming with limited success. The leaders of those groups, the Diggers, they also called themselves the New Levellers, one of them was called William Everard, the other was Gerard Winstanley, who did most of the writing, and he's definitely the best known one now. William Everard is the connection to John Portage, that's why I mentioned the Diggers, because after the Diggers community finished, that Everard was part of in 1649, he spent some time living with John Portage, who had the living at Bradfield, just back over the river, and Portage seems to have used this opportunity, seems to have opened up his rectory to quite a wide number of people, some of whom came there to live and work the harvest. So they were itinerant workers who would come and work in the local farms and live in his rectory for the period of time that they were there. Some of whom seem to have been drawn for religious reasons. So John Portage himself was somebody who saw visions. He had visions of various different things and seems to have inspired them in other people. William Everard also had visions. In fact, and things didn't end up so well for him in the long term, but and indeed neither for Portage, because these visions and the kind of religious implications of the visions and the sorts of religious arguments and statements that men like Portage and Everard meant that they got into trouble with the authorities for the sorts of things that they believed. And they adopted sort of some of the principles that were shared by movements like the Diggers that Everard had been involved with, but they weren't engaged in the same kind of activity, but they do seem to have had something of a kind of open community at the rectory in Bradfield for, again, at least a few months or a short period of time, until things sort of slightly fell apart. Portage at one point went into a trance during a church service, at which he was presumably officiating, I'm not sure, but given that he was the rector, you would think that was the case, in which he was reported to have started running around and bellowing like a bull, which is like a really nice little moment of Shakespearean transformation, I think, there, although he probably wouldn't have seen it like that. And he and Everard and others were then sort of came under the criticism of being sorcerers or witches, and that, you know, that doesn't go well in the 17th century, so that community didn't last. But I do like these, where we can find them, these moments, these images of communities of different sorts of lifestyles, different sorts of ways of living, which are present and are often not that well historically recorded, because people weren't necessarily writing about them at the time, but they do exist, and I find them interesting when we can come across them. Men like Everard and particularly Winstanley projected ideal societies in their writings. They wrote about the ways in which they thought the world could be made better, and they had a clear sense of the world as how it could be a better place. And they also attempted to live that in their own utopian societies in real life, which I think is interesting. I mean, it all gets a bit confused in their mysticism, but nonetheless, I think their efforts at living by the principles they espoused are very interesting and potentially inspiring, because for them, living at this time, you know, in the 1640s was a period of great social unrest in England because of the civil wars. Charles I is put to death in 1649 too, so it's a real time of change and upheaval. But that again seems to have been a moment in history where suddenly the space between the real world and utopia seemed very small. It seemed as though life might be lived differently. And in the 1650s, life was lived differently because there was no monarch. By the end of that period, or even by the middle of that period, arguably by about 1656, it's becoming increasingly difficult to rule in the way that Cromwell and the Protectorate are trying to rule. And, you know, by 1660, the dominant mood is that they want a king back. So that's quite a brief period of utopian potential, but it existed. And I'm interested in those moments in history where, you know, it looks like they're going to get there, even if they don't quite make it. I'm going to finish there because I think that's definitely enough. But I'll really happily answer any questions that I can, or just, you know, any comments as well if you're interested here. So thank you.
Can you tell us something more about the Utopian Experiment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really early days. So that slide that I had up is literally all we've got. But the purpose, the Utopian Experiment started because Nigel Arnold, who's a professor of meteorology at Reading and who's advised the government on climate change, or the previous government, a couple of governments ago, on climate change, lives on the same road as me, and we occasionally would bump into each other. And we had a train journey home once where he said, I'd really like to think about how we could use creative writing to deal with issues around climate change and how we communicate them, because his view, as I mentioned when I was talking, is that that the kind of dystopian visions of the future, which tend to be associated with climate change, put people off from engaging, and that if we can try and offer them positive models as well, that's a way of motivating change. So we had those conversations for quite a long time. I mean, over a period of about 7 years, we never did anything about it. I teach this course, and actually the pandemic kind of interfered with that because we were getting together a funding bid and then it didn't happen. I teach a course on utopias, which I realised belatedly was quite similar in its interest to a course that was also being taught in history. So my colleague Jeremy is also interested in utopia, but he teaches real-life utopian communities. So he's interested in intentional communities like communes, and how they work and how in history they've existed and lasted or not. And so I was also having conversations with him about how we could sort of bring some of our subjects together. And so the three of us basically just had a long talk, and the result of that talk was that we tried to think about where the overlaps were between our subjects and how we could try to communicate more clearly with each other. Because we had this sense that lots of us in the university were interested in the idea of utopia and the ideal society, but we weren't really communicating with each other. And so what we're trying to do is to bring everybody together. And at the symposium we had yesterday, it was fantastic. I mean, one of my colleagues, for example, Amy Butt, who is an architect, who works at the School of Architecture, has this brilliant project where she uses speculative fiction, science fiction, and she gets people to recreate the environments that are in those texts and to kind of imagine what they'd be like to live in, and even to try and, she had images of things they built that people were trying to crawl through and, you know, kind of inhabit them. And so the purpose of the project is partly to bring everybody together, so we're thinking about where our shared interests are, but particularly it's then to think about how can we use those actually to achieve change. And at the moment we don't know what that looks like. But I'm thinking, for example, about I mean, what I've tried to do in the talk today is just to show how people tend to think that you read utopias in order just to copy them. That you look at an ideal society and then you try and live like that. But I think actually how you're supposed to read utopias is more playfully than that. It's more about opening your mind and thinking about what is possible and what works for you and what doesn't. And so if we read utopias not as blueprints for society, because they're rubbish at that, but we can all read them and think, no, that wouldn't work. You'd never get people to do that. Usually utopias depend upon people being really good and everybody following the rules, and otherwise they don't work. So if we read them not like that, but we read them as like a playful experiment where you just opened your mind and said, okay, for this to work, what would have to happen? And so you can project an ideal aim and you can say, that's where we'd like to get to. Well, what's in the way? How could we be creative about that? How could we think differently about that problem if we know that that goal is something that we all want to achieve? And that's where I think that creativity has a real potential to help us think differently about how we approach problems, and that's where I think that humanities could offer something to science. But I don't know if it will.
When was the symposium recorded?
Sadly not, no, but we're having another meeting, and that will be the next phase, yeah, will be to create, and also the whole point of the project is not to, I mean, although yesterday it was all academics talking to other academics, with the exception of Chris Coates, who is a historian. He's written a book about communes and has lived on communes. He's not a historian, but apart from that, it's all academics talking to academics, and that's pointless. Due respect for academics in the room. What is the point of it? We do a lot of that. So what was most inspiring to me, and I think my colleagues yesterday actually, was the students who came and presented. And one of the things I noticed about the students' presentations is that they were much more creative in the sense of being radical than most of the academics ones were. So it is when we are involving students. But it was one student who stood up and said, well, why don't we just not have boundaries? Why don't we just not have borders? Because this is what it would achieve for us. It's that kind of thinking that I think, you know, that doesn't mean we're going to achieve that. We know we're not going to get that. But what would that look like on a small scale? What would it look, you know, it's about using that kind of radical... Sorry, this is such a long answer to your question. No, we didn't record it, but we will in the future.
Do you want some utopian land managers on your experiment?
Yes!
Because this estate is
yes!
awash with utopian land managers.
Yes, please!
We don't all agree with each other.
That's good.
But we all have different visions
Well,
of...
Yes.
But we do have multiple visions of utopian land and our relationship with it and how it should be managed and so on.
Yes, please. And that's partly why I wanted to talk about the relationship with the land today, because I think that's something that is really important to utopia, but it's also just important to the way we want to live. So, yes, please. Yeah.
That was absolutely fascinating, and I had multiple questions, but I'll minimise it. I have a very small claim to fame in this, in that I've claimed to be one of the only 10 people on earth who's read the whole of Simon Sharma's Landscape and Memory.
Wow.
Which is, do you know?
I haven't read all of it. I'm not number 9.
Well, it took me 20 years.
No,
I took it, it was so massive, I took it on holiday, but I didn't have enough holidays took 20 years of holidays to finish reading it.
Oh my
Anyway,
goodness.
that's all about this subject, and it's about French, German, British, and American concepts of pastoral utopias and ideal landscapes.
Thank you. I can't promise I'm going to read it.
It's absolutely astonishing, and he just did it in a sort of 5-year period among vast other works that he did. He's quite astonishing. But what I was going to ask about was my interest, well, I have multiple interests in this, but I'm particularly interested in ancient utopias. And I don't know if you've looked into these, but it seems to me that quite a lot of early societies, I'm thinking of the Georgics and the Bible particularly, both, and I think there are Greek equivalents, all have references to how, I think the Georgic, I'm not quoting it precisely, but it says something like, men used to take their living easily from the fields and forests, and then the curse is agriculture, is always farming. That's obviously the same in the Genesis, and I don't know if you've looked into that at all, and whether I've always wondered if that is whether there was a kind of folk memory of the Mesolithic before people farmed. This is something Ollie Douglas is interested in as well.
Okay.
Isn't the beginning of farming also the beginning of violence?
Well, there are multiple different views on this.
But I mean, people
No.
assess.
It's much more complicated than that.
Also, Sapiens by Yuval Harari also goes into the agricultural revolution and how that was a negative step.
Also trashed by the book that Ollie Douglas is just making me read called The Dawn of Everything by... Anyway, that trashes Yuval Harari, who I think is rubbish as well. So anyway,
literary argument.
I was just interested in whether there is a wider theme in ancient writings such as Roman and Greek and even in the Bible and so on about utopias. I mean, clearly the Garden of Eden is a utopia.
Yes, I think that is very common. I mean, a common theme both in ancient and in medieval utopias is that it's very easy to get food, to get the fruits of nature. You know, in the land of cocaine, the geese, not the Greece. Well, I suppose they would technically be greasy because they were cooked. The geese would fly through the sky, calling out, all hot, cooked, and then they would drop down and you could eat them. Some images, that's a medieval image. Some of those are like a sort of fantasy, like that, like a kind of a precursor of Big Rock Candy Mountain, where the rivers flow with food or whatever else. But what you're talking about specifically, yes, I think that's not uncommon. Yes, in the Georgics, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, there's not the Metamorphoses. There's a similar image in Ovid, in Hesiod as well.
That's the one.
Yeah, in Hesiod there is this similar sort of idea that human beings used to have a relationship with the land which involved a very simple exchange and just humans able to take everything that they wanted, and that I don't know whether, that's an interesting question, the degree to which farming is seen then as a sort of a punishment or of course it is in the Bible, as you say, associated with the fall of man.
In the Georgics, it's certainly regarded as a very bad move.
Right.
I'm not sure it's actually a punishment.
That's interesting.
I've
Yeah,
read
okay,
it for
that's
50 years. So
No, I don't know. I'd need to go back. My knowledge of those texts is quite incomplete, but I think it's definitely more widespread. Yeah. Yes, here and then.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, you didn't mention the Huxley's Island, I think it was, in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And I was just curious to hear your thoughts also on sort of the mind-altering substances that also feature in some utopias. I really view that, for instance, Dark Internet Stage was actually something that was inspired by Huxley, and I see here in the UK as one of it, and also the long-standing history as well.
Right. I haven't read The Island, but absolutely. Psychedelic drugs are something that a lot of utopian texts in the 20th century are interested in and represent in different ways, and they quite often have quite broad social functions as well as being about individual pleasure or individual transcendence. They often form ways of people connecting with each other or ways of making communities be visible, you know, so that they're not dangerous because they're sort of interested in taking drugs and having a fun time together, so they're not having an uprising. But I think that's really interesting. I think Huxley was very active in that sort of world, wasn't he himself, and really interested in how that might work. But there was some other reason why I needed to read The Island, and that means, so this is now 2 signs, so I'm putting it on my reading list, thank you. Is it? Yeah, I've heard so. And his other utopian writings or dystopian writings tend to get all the heat, so yeah, I'd love to read that, thank you. Yes?
Yeah, while you were talking, I was just thinking about the present, and because you said there are not so many utopias around, but I think there are utopias around, they're just very disconnected from the land. Probably most people in this room would see them as reactionary, of like, you know, continuing life in space and all this crap. I mean, I think there are like there are utopias, but they're not backed up by progressive movements. They're rather too of science fiction, microdosing, national conservative forces. And yeah, what connects to that also, what I think is really clever about utilizing utopia for different politics is somebody pointed out in the past, like maybe 60s, 70s, student uprisings, one of the slogans was like verbieten, verboten. It's like prohibiting is prohibited. You can't tell us what to do. We're free, we want to be free, we want to break free from the rules that society plays on us. And actually now we've swapped positions, and it's the reactionary right, which is posing on the side to be like, well, actually you can't tell us how to call you, or you know what language to use. And the problem with that is that that's like inherently, you find yourself in an inherently unattractive position. It's very unsexy to prohibit stuff.
Yes.
Whereas sort of a push for you know what you're describing, utopian Shakespeare, it's universe where everything is possible, where you can push into creativity. That also has a political pull,
Yes.
which we have to reappropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely right. Yeah, I think that's completely right. I really like that idea of reappropriating creativity and being confident in doing that. Yeah. I think it is difficult, isn't it, that there's a sort of, that we're very suspicious of utopian and kind of idealism and I sort of telling those sorts of stories when, partly because, as you say, I mean, a lot of the kind of the utopia is being used in so many ways that we are suspicious of. So it's kind of being uncoupled from its original functions, I think. Definitely with things like space travel and managing to live forever and all of those sorts of things that probably don't deliver. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. That's so informative. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi Chloe, thank you for the talk as well.
Oh, you're welcome.
Like the sheep, humanity sheep that you put in. It made me think about you know what your thoughts are with speciesism. And I'm not sure if you've heard of speciesism, where we treat different animals differently, right? You know, a utopia, you know, for me, the way I look at it, surely there's got to be some sort of way we've got to move toward utopia and treat animals differently, you know, with more freedom. You know, I drive down here and I look at the horses and thinking, well, they're not really free, that's someone's property. You know, like, what's your thoughts about that with a utopia? if you want to lean in that direction.
Yeah, well, I don't, I mean, you know, this is like a really classic academics thing to say, but I don't feel qualified. I don't feel qualified to answer that question, actually. Next. No, so I'm not qualified to answer that question, but any more than I can, you know, just to say that I think it's really...
What's your intuition?
My intuition, thank you. My intuition is that you're probably right, and that probably we will look back on the way that we treat and have treated animals in the 20th and 21st centuries, and realise that that was a big part of unfinished business of progressive politics and trying to live in a progressive society. Yeah, I mean, and for most of us, I think, you know, I mean, and that is quite troubling. And how we, I mean, what I'm trying to think about in answer to your question is what utopias can offer us as ways of changing, or as ways of doing things differently. One of the things I think they could maybe offer us is that sense of inversion, of kind of radical, like the man-eating sheep. The reason that Moore uses that metaphor is that he's saying you've got it wrong. You're allowing something to happen that's not natural, and this is the consequence. I can't think of utopias, certainly from my period, where there's what you might think of as a kind of speciesist argument, which would say animals need to be given liberation and freedom and have their rights upheld properly. But I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure people are writing them. So I think that what utopias could offer us is the space to imagine what that might be like. What would that world look like? Like, how would it work? Utopias aren't very good at showing us how to get places exactly, but they're good at showing us what those places might look like. And I think that in itself is a very valuable act. So I think we need to write one.
Yeah, no, thank you for your intuition, and I like the way you said, read Utopia and new child in a very, playful way.
Yeah,
I really like that, so that is really like the golden nugget.
Oh, good. Oh, that's nice. Thanks. Yes, yeah, and then more. Yeah, sorry.
Can I ask, probably an obvious question today, how do you feel that AI is going to affect the concept of utopia or dystopia?
Whoa. I mean, personally, I feel, I get dystopian feelings around AI, and it makes me feel anxious, and I don't think it's very good for the planet, based on my understanding of it. So those things are, I think, I mean, it depends who you ask. Some would say that it's here and we're going to have to, work with it. And certainly as an educator, we've spent quite a long time just humming very loudly like this about AI, because we don't really want to have to deal with it, but we are having to deal with it now, and we're having to use it with our students, and that's increasingly the case. And I know some colleagues who would say, well, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't ever use it with our students. We shouldn't encourage them to use it. We shouldn't be open to that possibility. And others who would say, well, come on, we've got to, it's a tool like anything else, and we've got to teach them to use it properly and everything. So, others would feel very differently. I don't like it. I don't like reading things that are written by AI. It makes me feel unpleasant. I don't like the fact it's nicked all my books. They're not paying me any money. Not that anybody, I mean, I was saying to a colleague the other day how I feel really, because there was quite a big fuss on, social media about AI scraping everybody's books. But I mean, given that, like I said, like a handful of people have read my book. So the idea that AI might be sharing it with more people, maybe that's a good thing. At least the AI's read it. That's another pair of eyes over my book. So I feel sort of secretly quite pleased about that. But no, it's not good that the ways that AI work are dystopian, for sure, because they're not about paying people properly.
Aidan, have you read Are You Are? Are You Are? It's a play by Karol Čapek.
No.
That starts off as a utopia. So that's how it could go.
The first use of the word robot.
Yeah. That's a dystopia.
And that's organic robot, so that's even more fun.
Yeah. I just felt that was quite a good answer.
Yeah.
There was 2 points where I was in your talk, that echoed more contemporary thought, so I could turn that to question. So in the guy with the using the tree as a metaphor, what he was talking about echoed what I think gets called French socialism, equality, fraternity, whatever the other one is, equality. Right. They were there. There were different words, but they were in there. Weren't they? And then the guy who was the preacher, who was the friend of the diggers, who was having what we call mad, with mad outbursts. He was like, these days you get locked up and called schizophrenic. And so, but in 1960s R.T. Lang, there was a veneration for the mad, thinking they had visionary thoughts that should be integrated into society, and then we find people saying that's echoed in more primitive communities, but that may just be taken ideals that not realised. Whereas in contemporary society, we could say that contemporary dystopias, if you like that now, you get locked up and forced, made tranquilizers until you shut. As opposed to the idea of going, these people have got a message for us. What is this message? How do we deal with that? So those two contemporary echoes.
Yeah, that's
I'll
really
just see if you want to expand on that, and if you thought any other contemporary echoes. And I guess I could say, I imagine that however we see society now, there will be aspects of utopia and dystopia. It's dystopia, isn't it?
It's easy to spot those.
Yeah. Like we could look at the concept of AI. It allows people to do things really fast and write reports really fast.
Yeah.
That'll make a huge number of people unemployed.
Yes.
Yeah,
and why can't AI do the jobs we don't want to do? Because
but lays off those people, but that always happens in capitalism.
Of course it does. Yeah.
That's what Marx was talking about.
Yeah.
Those people to make profit.
Exactly. While profit drives. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think those points of correspondence are both really interesting. I think that, I mean, with John Portage, one of the people who he also had in his house was, who stayed there for a period of time, was Elizabeth Poole, who was exactly like that. She was like a mystic, basically. And so she used to have these visions where she believed that God was speaking to her and she would report what God said. And you know, some people believed her and treated her like a holy woman. And there's a tradition of that, isn't there, all the way back, you know, through sort of medieval records and history and literature of people who are believed to have a connection with God. They're treated as very special, but they are always walking a tightrope of toleration. And when they start to say things that are heretical or, you know, sound a little bit like treason, then things don't go so well for them. So they're always dependent on political toleration, and I think there's a parallel there to what we do with people who behave in ways that we don't like and don't think is socially acceptable. When, you know, nothing that Elizabeth Poole said was criminal, but it could be seen as being, you know, dangerous, politically dangerous. And of course, you're right, absolutely, there are parallels to what happens to people in that position today. And we just have different methods, but it's the same goal, isn't it? Which is...
Yeah, with the tower, we like making profit part.
Sure, yeah. And I was just hearing today, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, different people have different feelings on that. I was just hearing today, listening, I can't remember anyone's names, basically, so it makes anecdotes quite pointless for me, but anyway, a man has written a book about sleep treatment and how sleep treatment was used, in which people were put to sleep for months at a time, and while they were asleep they would have electroconvulsive therapy, and sleep treatment was usually used on people who didn't consent to ECT because they were scared of it, and so sleep treatment was used to make them passive so that they could have the ECT. And you know, that's not that long ago, it's the 70s sort of, so you know, it's slightly frightening that those methods, you know, are still present and still usable, yeah, for sure.
You might want to get back to your children because it's just I've got some ideas for practical applications of what you've been talking about, but I will email you about
please.
it. Yeah,
And
really, really interesting.
Any ideas, like anything, I would love